This channel is supported by TrueFire. TrueFire is an online library of lessons from some of my favourite players. There's thousands of lessons on there. You can use the promo code JNC40 to get 40% off of any of their courses. So today I've got a gig in Ilfracombe and it's going to take me an hour and 20 minutes to get there. I've got to get there for about 1:30. Got an acoustic set up, playing an hour's acoustic set from 2:30. Then the whole band, or a larger band, gets there at 6 o'clock and we'll play music until 10, 11. Then there'll be music continue to play as we load out. This venue in particular is a place called Ilfracombe Tunnels Beaches. It's a bad loading. Anyway, I wanted to ask the question like whether it's worth gigging anymore. For today, this is the way that I get paid like the most money for doing a gig, because I got essentially 2 gigs in one day at the same venue. So I get £400 for a day's work, which is good money, right? And any musician, any gigging musician should at least bear in mind that to earn kind of £400 in a lot of other jobs takes a while, right? Now, obviously this is getting into towards my 9th, 10th year of gigging in function bands and wedding bands and stuff like that. But there is a little bit of a question mark over, like, is it worth gigging anymore? So I did a video kind of looking at how much I used to earn when all of my income was basically from being a gigging musician. You can check that video out if you want. But sort of my peak year was about like year 5. But I think I was already by that point had figured out that you need to do something else as well. But sort of my very biggest year of gigs, I did 159 gigs, took home like, well, I didn't even take home, but earned £19,225. So 159 gigs. So it's really difficult to do more gigs than that in a year, unless you're going to be touring or something. So think 159 gigs, that's, you know, 3 a week. That's hard to actually fill your diary that much, is what I've found. So let's talk about some of this stuff. The first thing that I used to do that helped to fill the diary was sort of cafe gigs and pub gigs. These would pay sort of between 50, if you're lucky, 50 and £75 for me, because myself and my wife, we wanted to get into these places and play. Nowadays, I wouldn't think that's a good thing to do particularly. I think there are better ways to earn that kind of money, because it's going to take probably 3-4 hours, right, at least. And if you do the math on that, it's not particularly well paid, right? The other thing is that you fill your diary and you get busy, and any time that you're kind of actually gigging, it's going to possibly take away from actually learning material for other gigs. The stuff that is profitable and does make quite a bit of money for me is the wedding gig, the function gig, And I think if you got onto a touring gig with an original kind of signed artist, the money would be somewhat commensurate there as well. If you're running a band yourself, I found an article on this, like actually touring as an original artist without a huge following, I think is pretty much not profitable anymore. I think there was an article where a lot of... Here's the article that I found from... This popped up on my phone the other day about bands touring. And for instance, Nubian Twist, I've covered one of their songs once. A 9-piece Afro-jazz outfit, tens of millions of streams on Spotify. 8-show tour Europe, they're predicting a loss of £4,931.28. But they've got funding from the BPI Music Export Growth Scheme, so these are like grants, essentially. They get paid £5,000 for a festival, which sounds like a lot, but it's between 9 people, right, as well. And the leader of the band, Tom, paid all of his band members first, and presumably crew. So that's actually, it gives you a point about what part of the band it's kind of better to be part of. If you're a session musician in these bands and stuff like that, that might be the more reliable way to be. As partly, like, you see people complain about how much band leaders get paid, but if you're the person like leading the band, you're also the guy that's like responsible for the label and stuff. If you're a session musician, you're gonna get paid at least, right? So yeah, after a festival gig, £277.60. Yeah, not a lot. Gamble whether I'm going to make anything while everyone else gets paid a guaranteed amount. That is the gamble of being the artist. You know, everyone who's not Taylor Swift and Ed Sheeran. Japanese television, if you've heard of them. Headline 100 and 300 capacity venues. This is the touring side that you don't necessarily hear too much. Right, their tour's going to lose them £700. It's a hobby that just about pays for itself. And it seems to be that, yeah, except for Taylor Swift and people like that, that touring in general is barely profitable for a lot of artists. This is a band, you know, English teacher, who, again, I have to say, I haven't heard of these. So these are like below mainstream, but like actually touring musicians. They're signed, doing an 800 capacity hometown show. And alongside that, it's totally normal for people to be living on benefits, living at home, sofa surfing. Yeah, unable to afford rent and stuff like that. And for instance, paying themselves a wage of £500 a month from the band pot. I guess the original music thing is its own sort of weird space. But as you're watching this and as I'm doing it, and I know loads of people working in the wedding kind of band and that sort of situation, that for me is, and wedding and functions is actually a reliable or more reliable source of income. And yeah, the money that you get for that, sort of between £200, £300, it seems to be about the standard for me. So like, yeah, £200-300. Now obviously the idea would be that the more you can get of these in the diary, the better. And the way that you do that is by doing dep gigs for other bands generally. So in my own band that I play with all the time, we're not actually super busy, you know, maybe 20-30 gigs a year. And similarly in the bands that I used to play in the day here, I was playing in a 60s band where we might have 1-2 gigs often, but there'd be, you know, gaps in the diary, and the way you fill those gaps, and I guess this is the difficult part about being a musician, is by doing gigs with other bands. And as much as this sounds like, well, that could be a really positive thing, that is where it takes up a lot of your time. And if you're juggling between different bands, you might have 10, 15, 20 songs that you have to learn, especially if you're new to this, right? So that is where it's really difficult, and that is where, say you had 160 gigs in the year, the part that you're not getting and not factoring into this is the amount of time that it takes to actually learn all of that stuff. So for instance, if I'm playing with a band that I've not played with before and they've got a particularly tricky set, I'm having to put in daily work, kind of listening to the set. It might be an hour a day for a week. It might be a little more than that. It might be, you know, every time I'm driving the car somewhere, I might have to put on the set list so that I'm listening to it and kind of doing some semi-active learning of it. That is the kind of difficult part of gigging. And the other thing is that you know, when I'm talking about the income, I'm not actually talking about your expenses like the costs of getting to the gig, buying food when you're at a gig, and all that stuff. Not only that, but for weddings and function bands, the obvious thing is that you're going to be gigging on the weekends. And so weddings are also incredibly seasonal, so you'll probably be quite quiet in January, February, and March. You'll probably be quite quiet in September, October. And then those summer months is where it's really quite a lot of gigs to juggle. And that can be quite stressful to look at the calendar, and you might have a couple of gigs one week and you're looking ahead and you're like, oh, I've actually got 3 set lists to learn there. I don't really miss that too much. So for me, I decided that I'm actually better off putting some of my attention elsewhere, but I like to keep gigs in the diary because I think it actually helps to make sense of quite a lot of what we do. You know, I can't see the point in having, you know, some of this gear if I was never going to gig. I don't necessarily think that it's that easy to stay connected with some of the ideas about what we'd be doing. So for me, when I'm reviewing bits of gear or demoing bits of gear, in the back of my mind, I'm thinking, how would I use this on a gig? Would I use this? And that's sort of the glue that kind of helps to make sense of quite a lot of stuff. And I think that's probably the case for a lot of musicians. However, I think in 2024, it's not necessarily that realistic to expect to make all of your income from solely gigging. It would be my conclusion. This was something that I kind of concluded early on, but in 2015, when I decided to try and do music, I did decide there and then that what I was going to focus on was gigging specifically for however long I did that. And I did that for maybe 3, 4, 5 years. Once lockdown set in, I had already been doing like YouTube and Instagram stuff that whole time basically. And so it was kind of like a refocus of attention. People did ask in that video like how much I make from YouTube and stuff like that. It's more than I make gigging, obviously. So these days it's like 20, 30, 40 gigs that I do a year. And the real key to this is that you can kind of scale it in your mind. Like if you can get 20, £200 gigs, that's £4,000. If you can get 30, that's 6,000, right? However, where it makes a really big difference, if you can get that fee up a bit, so like £300, if you can do 20, £300 gigs, that's 6,000. That's, I think, how you can try and figure this stuff out. The guys that I know that play in bands that get a bit more money for it, I think you're able to help pay for an actual life. Whereas if you're doing lots of kind of smaller cafe gigs and lots of not so well paid stuff, jazz gigs, I don't think it's very sustainable at all. And you're going to need another job, whether that's teaching or whether that's whatever it is. But is it worth gigging? Yes, it's worth it. Is it worth it monetarily? Are you going to get rich from it? Not so much. And I think it's probably good to have that in mind when you're doing it, so that you've always got in mind, well, I need other sources of income. Think about 160 gigs to earn like £20,000. Like that's not a lot for the amount of effort it is to get out there and do 160 gigs in a year. That's, yeah, a lot of gigs. Let me know your thoughts in the comments. Are you a gigging musician? How many do you do? How many do you try to keep in the diary? Where do you work? Love to know your thoughts. Cheers.